history and all the uh, different eras and different situations the church had to go through, and where we are now. It's in backtracks to help us understand from the first century onwards till the 16th to the 18th centuries what happened in the church. And last week we had the blessing of talking about the Portuguese coming to India and how the church was overtaken by the Roman Catholic faith, and which led to the Synod of Diamper, and ultimately the Roman faith being propagated in all of the Church of Malabar, and the churches that existed at that time being brought under the Roman faith. So as it begins talking in Unit 4, uh, by mentioning that the Marthoma Christians, known then, being in two separate camps. And, even though the purpose which the Portuguese had entertained about the Church of Malabar was achieved by them successfully at the Synod of Diamper, meaning that their intention was to bring the church under the one Roman faith, and they were successful to an extent, even though forcefully, in doing that at the Synod of Diamper. Uh, but the people who were forced to convert were not entirely happy, and it leads to the rebellion of 1653 as we know it today. And the two questions that Achin tries to answer in this unit are: how did the division in the church occur, especially at this time? And also, how did a church which was part of the Nestorian Church of Persia, he's talking about the Church of Malabar, happened to fall within the communion of a church which was more critical of the Nestorian Church than the Portuguese? And he's talking about the Church of Malabar finally coming under the Syrian Antiochian Church. We had, I believe, in the first week talked about what Nestorianism meant. Nestorianism comes from the teachings of Nestorius, who taught that there were two separate persons in Christ, two separate personhood in Christ. And we know that goes against the faith of the first councils as to who Christ is. So Ajit goes into detail, and he begins talking about the arrival of a bishop that was called Ahatalla. And the Roman Catholic historians and the scholars, when we read through their version of history, claim that the church came under Rome completely after the Synod of Diamper, right? But as we said, this was not true, because there were still a lot of people who were not happy with the change. And there is no doubt that there were people in the church who would have appreciated being under the Church of Rome, and for whatever reasons was more fond of the Latin traditions. But to say that the church as a whole was under the Roman yoke, cannot be right, because there was a large body of people in the church who would have given up not only the Portuguese, but even Rome, if they had a chance to go back to their old ways of worship under the Persian church, or to Assyrian speaking Eastern church. And this is what the history of the Malabar church shows us clearly. And that section of people who still wished to go back to their old ways or to a Syrian Eastern Church stood behind the Archdeacon Thomas. And the archdeacons, until then, were the leaders of the Syrian Christians, and they continue to guide the people, even though now officially the church is under the Church of Rome. That faction still strong was still strong in Malabar, and they continued under the leadership of Archdeacon Thomas. And as you can imagine, Rome was not happy with this. And it was during this time in 1652 that this bishop that was called Ahatalla, who was believed to be the patriarch Mar Ignatius of the Antiochian Syrian Church, comes down to India in order to deliver the church from the persecution of the Portuguese rule. However, he comes to North India with intentions to travel to the south, but he was captured by the Portuguese and was taken and jailed in Mylapore. And they kept him in custody with the intention of taking him to Goa and trying him there in court. But meanwhile, he was jailed in Mylapore. There was two seminary students who had gone on a pilgrimage to Mylapore, And they come across this person by chance, and they understand this Eastern bishop has come down and he's been jailed, and they get an opportunity to visit him. And when they come back to Kerala, when these seminarians come back to Kerala, they are sent a letter that Ahatullah has wrote for the Christians in Malabar, addressing the Archdeacon Thomas. And of course, from reading the letter, Archdeacon Thomas comes to know of the arrival of this bishop, and he begins to publicize the news among the members of the community that was awaiting such a news that they will be delivered from under the Roman Church. And the Kerala Christians who were awaiting such a news were very much disturbed about what was going to happen to the Eastern bishop who had come to guide them, but who was now jailed because he was going to be tried, and ultimately he would be killed because he would not go along with the Roman faith. And during this time, the Portuguese took More Ignatius, or Ahatala as he was known, to Goa in order to try him and take the necessary action against him. And at the same time, as per the request made by Ahatala, Archdeacon Thomas and a sect or a group of the Christians in Malabar comes to Cochin, where the head of the Portuguese church was, or Portuguese church in India was, and they put in a request in order to release the bishop. And obviously, this request is not met, and the Portuguese does not let go of Ahatullah. And later news comes out that Ahatullah was ordered to leave the coast of India. And as he was leaving, or on his ship, as he was traveling back, was attacked and he was killed. So this news of a bishop coming down in order to try to help the people that were there, that was under the Persian church initially, trying to bring them back to the Syriac faith. The news of this person being attacked, jailed, and then maybe killed upsets the people, obviously. And they decide that it is time to take some action. They decide that they can no longer be forced under the Roman faith by the Portuguese power, and it was time that they stood up and took action against this. And that action is the rebellion that we talked about earlier, which we come to know as the Coonan Cross Oath. And the Coonan Cross Oath took place on January 3rd, 1653, when a great number of people gathered in front of a church in what we know as modern-day Mattancherry in Cochin. And in their despair, they tied ropes of great length to a cross which was landing on one side, and uttered the words of the pledge, holding on to the cross as the archdeacon led them in this pledge. As you can see in the picture on the PowerPoint, the people stood on both sides and they held the rope that was tied to the cross, and they took a pledge that we will no longer serve a foreign power, and we will be our own people and our own church. And that rebellion is of great importance because this begins a time of ecclesiastical freedom in the Indian church, or the Church of Malabar. And the oath which was taken at Mattancherry, like we said, on January 3rd in 1653, was a great victory for the Archdeacon Thomas, who was the leader of the people, because the community almost as a whole accepted his leadership after this. And following this event, there was a meeting of the church people that was held in connection with the 3-day Lent that year, and it was held at the church of Edappalli in February. And a great crowd of men and women gathered on that occasion, and they declared that archdeacon to be their administrator under the title of Martoma. Until then, the leaders were using the title archdeacon, and then now onwards, you will see them using the title of Martoma. And there was also an appointment to the ecclesiastical order as Metropolitan of Archdeacon Thomas, and he becomes Martoma. And in addition to this, the meeting also appointed a council consisting of 4 priests in the church to help the archdeacon in his work. And their names are given in page 114. And if you haven't read, I would definitely urge you to read this section also, because those priests who were appointed, the 4 priests who were appointed, are of importance because we will get to see them later also. And they play an important role in shaping the religious history of South India during this time. But going forward, since the uh, Martoma, or the Archdeacon Thomas, was elected by the people and the priest of the church during that time, instead of an episcopal coming down and officially elevating him to the throne of metropolitan, his uh, episcopal orders would always come into question from this time onwards by the Portuguese and later the Dutch when they come in. Uh, so that is what that is a summary of lesson one. And one thing to remember from this is the rebellion, or the Koninkrozat, that was done in 1653. That's a date that we all should remember, because until then, for about 60 years, the church was under the Roman faith, and they could take it no more. And they said, "We want our church back. We want our history, our lineage back." And they said, under the Archdeacon Thomas, they took this oath saying that the church is completely free and we want our own authority and not to follow a foreign rule. And in lesson two, Achin begins to talk how the Roman Church would not simply accept the Koninkrozat and go their own way in peace, but they would not face defeat, and they would begin to continue to work in order to bring the people back under the Church of Rome. And by about the 17th century, the Portuguese power in the political power of the Portuguese in India begins to decline. And by now, Rome had come to realize that it was possible for the missionaries of the non-Portuguese nations also to carry on missionary work in Eastern lands, and thereby to bring an end to the Portuguese monopoly in missionary work in India. Right? Before we talked about how the order of monks last week, we explained there was 5 different orders. And the final order was the Jesuits, who were doing a lot of work in different parts of India, especially in southern part. And they had kind of taken on the religious authority and also the political power that they had with them, and they used both of it to their advance in order to propagate the faith, the Catholic faith in the South Indian region. And in 1657, the Carmelites, a new group of the Catholic order, came to Kerala, and they begin their missionary work there. And the most famous of this group was a person called Sebastiani, and who was very successful in propagating the Catholic faith and overtake many of the church to the Roman faith. Many of the churches that had existed there under the Syrian faith was converted to under the Roman faith. And the most important reason for Sebastiani's success was the fact that he could legitimately question the validity of Thomas' episcopal standing. As we said earlier, this could be called into question, as it was the priest and the lay people that elevated their archdeacon to the position of Martoma. So the Sebastiani, when he comes down, he's able to create confusion among the people, saying that this man's episcopal orders are not proper for these and these reasons. So of course, those people who are loyal to Archdeacon Thomas or Marthoma continued to follow him, but Sebastiani was able to create confusion and still convert many people to the Roman faith. And he and his supporters made use of the question of this legitimacy, and those who felt a dislike for the Marthoma or the Metran at that time joined Sebastiani, and the others who cared more for the freedom of the church continued to stand by Marthoma. And the efforts to convert many people and bring the Church of Malabar under the full control of Rome continued. Even after the political power of the Portuguese Church declining, for the Portuguese government declining, the Roman Church continued to do its work, and in order to convert the people to come under the Roman Church. And Marthoma, as you can imagine, faced many persecutions during this time, including jail time at several times, and there were several attempts at his life during this time also. We see a change in the political order, in the political power in January of 1663. The Dutch, who had come to modern-day Sri Lanka, which is off the coast of South India, they had come to Sri Lanka, they had taken over Sri Lanka. And after that, they come towards where the Portuguese was ruling in South India, and they begin to fight with the Portuguese. and they invade Cochin, which was the political power center of the Portuguese government. And they invaded Cochin in 1663, defeating the Portuguese. And and this was, somewhat a relief to Martoma, because the Portuguese were now focused on defending themselves against the Dutch, and not so much focused on attacking Martoma and his followers, right? So Martoma at this time continued to write letters to the patriarchs of the East, requesting for an Eastern bishop to be sent to Kerala for helping the church and to ratify his consecration as bishop, right? So there was two needs, like the church needs help. We need to send somebody, an Eastern bishop who can lead us under the Syrian faith. And also when that bishop comes, he would be able to ratify the episcopal orders of Marthoma also. And he waited for a period of 12 years under desperation without hearing back anything. But in 1665, Marthoma's wait comes to an end, and Mar Gregorios of Jerusalem, an Antiochian Syrian prelate, arrived in Calicut, and Marthoma and his people received him with open arms. And this is where Achan goes into lesson 3, and he begins to talk about the division in the Church of Malabar, right? As we know, Marthoma had two objectives, and first was to encounter the charge that his episcopal orders were imperfect, and second was to bring an end to the custom of royal power entering the religious field and forcing people one way or another. Every time when the Portuguese came, and then the different orders of monks under the Portuguese came, then later the Dutch came, all of them, what they did was they created a parallel administration, right? Marthoma was leader of the Church of Malabar, but they would appoint an archbishop and bring the church officially under their rule and say that Marthoma is not the ruler, but this archbishop whom we have appointed is the true ruler who should be in control of the church. So that has been ongoing for many years. And of course, Marthoma is fighting for his survival, and he's hoping that the help that he's requesting from the Eastern Church will bring about an end to this political power entering the religious field and trying to control the church, right? And so when in 1663 the Dutch invaded Cochin and drove the Portuguese out of there, the second problem about the political power interfering in religious matters was somehow or somewhat solved for Marthoma, right? Because the Dutch later is not as strong as the Portuguese were in interfering with the religious matter. Their focus was more on the political power and keeping the political power and using the resources of South India for their own sake. And they're not very strong about interfering with the church. They're still not favorable of the Syrian Christians and the church that was there, the Church of Malabar, but still they did not interfere as much as the Portuguese did in religious matters of the church and the episcopal orders of the church. But however, the Dutch victory did bring another problem to the Syrian Christians, and that was a native bishop to lead the Roman Catholic section was raised, confronting Marthoma. And this happened because when the Portuguese are being forced out of India, out of South India, uh, as a last nail in the coffin, what they do is they appoint an archbishop who's a local from among the people. Until that time, it was always a foreigner that was appointed, especially from Portugal, that was appointed in order to lead the church as the archbishop. But now, when they are being forced out of India slowly by the Dutch, they put into power a bishop named Parambil Chandi. And remember, we talked earlier that 4 priests were appointed to help the archdeacon or Marthoma in church matters. 2 of those priests actually converted to the Catholic faith later on and begins to fight against the archdeacon or Marthoma, right? And one of them was Parambil Chandi, and he gets ordained to be the archbishop as the Portuguese is leaving, and he is put in charge of the Church of Rome that is in India. So soon after he was made bishop, the first thing, of course, he does is that he excommunicated Marthoma, saying that Marthoma does not have episcopal orders and he should not be followed. You should be following me. One benefit of Portuguese doing this for the Roman faith was that, now the people had a local person in power instead of obeying the orders of a foreigner, right? So this created a lot of problem for Marthoma, and the ongoing fight continued for many years to prove who truly was the ruler of the Syrian Christians in India. Um, and when we said the Dutch invaded Cochin, what one thing they did was that they destroyed many of the churches in that area, except some of the churches dedicated to Catholic saints, especially Saint Francis of Assisi. And in addition, they ordered all missionaries, except 4 or 5 Franciscans, to leave Cochin. And this is when the Portuguese, on their way out, appoints Bishop Chandi as the Archbishop of the Roman faith in India. And the Dutch, for some reason, favored Bishop Chandi over Marthoma's faction. They were not big fans of the Syrian Christians over there. Yeah, because even though the Dutch were of the Protestant faith, they somehow seemed to favor Bishop Chandi, maybe because he was put in power by the Portuguese missionaries. And that also caused problems for Marthoma's faction. And this, when we talk about these things, we easily say these things in a few lines, but uh, how we understand from the book and from the general study of Indian history, Indian church history, is that these are many years of persecution that the churches are facing. You can imagine one day you're worshiping under one faith, and the next day a certain rulers or bishops or new priests come into your church and take over your church and begin to tell you to worship in a separate way, in a different language, in different traditions, right? And that can be very hard on the church in Malabar that is facing this for many years, and its head, Marthoma. But the Syrian Christians continued to fight these persecutions from different fronts for many years after this, right? And during the time when the Dutch were in control, there were Western missionaries also working in certain parts of Kerala, and all of them had only one idea with reference to the Syrian Christians, and that was to sway them more towards the continued allegiance of the Roman Catholic Church. Uh, so the attack on the Christians in that existed, the traditional Christians that existed in India from first century, is from many different fronts, right? They are fighting the Carmelites, they're fighting the Jesuits, they're fighting the Dutch, the modern day Western missionaries. All of these people are intending to convert the Christians that are already there and bring them under their political power. Uh, and Marthoma, who was under constant attack, received some good news and relief when he received the news that an Eastern bishop had arrived in Calicut. So this is what the church and Marthoma has been hoping for a long time, for about 12 years, as he had been writing letters to many parts of the Eastern churches, asking for help for what was going on in India. And this person who came, this bishop who came, this Eastern bishop who arrived in Calicut, was the bishop of Jerusalem, who was in communion with the Syrian church of Antioch, and his name was Mar Gregorius. And Mar Gregorius came with the company of 2 monk priests, and he was very much welcomed by Marthoma and a large body of priests and laymen at that time. And historians see this event as a means of deliverance that the church needed at that time. For a church that was continuing to lose its people and its faith, that was being uh, put under a different church using political power. This was very much needed because they were hoping for a deliverer to come and help them in order to regain their faith that they had practiced in the first centuries. And Marthoma and Mar Gregorius were engaged in the services of the church with cooperation with each other. Mar Gregorius, when he came first, he did not try to take over the church. He understood what the people were going through, and he was very much in cooperation with Marthoma, and they helped each other in order to kind of revive the church. And as a result, the freedom lovers in the Church of Malabar entered this new phase of history, and they accepted the relationship with the Syrian Church of Antioch, with which it had no connections before that. And Achan makes an interesting note, when he cites E.M. Philip, who he has been using throughout the book, saying that E.M. Philip makes an attempt in saying that the Church of Antioch had a connection with the Indian Church, even in the 7th through 9th century. But Achan kind of makes the point that there is no evidence proving that point. And it is in the 16th century when we first have evidence of the Syrian Church coming in contact with the Indian Church, and the Indian Church accepting and welcoming them with open arms. The intention of Mar Gregorius was to bring the Church of Malabar, the liturgy and the traditions of the Syrian Church of Antioch. But he knew that it was not possible to do that all of a sudden, right? With all the persecution the church is facing, all the traditions that were trying to be fed to the people by the Roman Church, it was not an easy task. And Gregorius found it convenient to use the Syriac language to have dealings with the church people, right? So, because Syriac was a language that was used in India before, because the Indian church was under the Persian church, which was also using Syriac. So for that reason, they found it easy in order to communicate with the church leaders and help the churches change slowly. He didn't change many things initially, but slowly he began to change the vestments that the priests would wear, the ecclesiastical calendars, the diptychs that were used, the saints that were revered, and all of these things. Slowly he was changing from the Latin tradition back to the Syriac tradition. And Mar Gregorius joined Marthoma in confirming the Church of Malabar in its Eastern Syrian tradition against the Roman Catholic Church. And a common language and a common tradition shared by the Church of Persia and the Church of Antioch made his efforts successful. And Mar Gregorius died on 24th of April in 1671, and he was buried in Northern Paravur Church. And on the 22nd of April of 1673, 2 years later, Marthoma, who was the head of the people at that time, Marthoma the First, also left this world, and he was buried in the church of Angamali. It was possible, at the end of his life, as he departs from this world, Marthoma was able to keep the pledge that he had taken in 1653 by saying that we will not be under foreign rule anymore. We will have our own church, our own leaders, to leave his life with some satisfaction of having fulfilled that, because now the church was independent, it had its own tradition, and it had regained its faith in the Orthodox tradition. So he leaves the world with somewhat of a satisfaction that he was able to complete what he was setting out to do in 1653. And in a letter that Achan translates in the book that was from 1668, written by Marthoma, these points are made very clear. Achan says the first point he makes is that the first 1600 years of the Church of Malabar was not part of the Roman Catholic Church. The Portuguese had no legitimate authority to change the customs which the Church had observed for hundreds of years. Do not the people who lived and died during this period in close relationship with the Church then deserve Christian salvation? So Achan is making the point that for the first 1600 years, the Church of Malabar was not under the Roman faith, and the Portuguese authorities did not have any right to come into this foreign land and to begin to convert the people who were Christians already, who were there worshiping in their own traditions, to convert them to the Latin traditions. And Achan is asking the question, all those people who lived for that many years, practiced this faith and passed away, are they not receptible of salvation? Or does salvation not exist for them because they were not under the Roman faith? Another thing that Achan points out in this letter that was written in 1668 is that all these years the church had permitted priests to marry. And with the arrival of the Roman Church, they prohibited marriage to the deacons and priests. So that was a change that Achan points out in the letter. And the fast, which the Church of Malabar used to hold, had been changed by the Portuguese. As you can imagine, the fast days, according to the ecclesiastical calendar of the Eastern Church versus the calendar of the Roman Church, and the saints who are celebrated, the feast days who are celebrated, would have been changed under the new church. And another thing, or final thing he points out in this letter, is that we should believe not in the Church of Rome, but in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And of course, he's mentioning the church that is, mentioned in the creed, also in the from the Council of Nicaea and then Ephesus. So he's saying that the Church of Rome is a foreigner that came to India, that's to South India, the Church of Malabar, and took over them. And they had no prior relations to the church, and their faith was basically trampled over by this political power that came in first to India for trade relations, and later saw that this would be a good place for them to set a camp in. And they saw that there was already an existing church there, and they had the intention of adding numbers to the Roman faith. So they did everything in their power to do just that. But the church was able to regain its freedom after 1653, fighting for many years. And now it was reinstated into the Eastern Syriac faith. And lesson 4 begins to talk about the title Marthoma and the bishops who held that title. And this title continued to be the head of the Syrian Christians until about the 18th century. And Achin goes into detail and explains the succession and what type of leaders they were for the church, the challenges they faced. Were they able leaders? What were they able to do during their tenure? And all these things are mentioned in detail by Achin in lesson 4. And the Church of Malabar continued to exist in two groups, one Catholic and one Orthodox. And several attempts were made at unity again, but were not successful. It explains that different bishops coming and going, they tried to do different things in order to bring unity in the church, because these are people of same culture, people of same history that are in two separate camps now. And attempts at unity were made, but it ultimately was not successful. As you can imagine, if there's a faction that wanted to continue under the Roman Church, and if there's a faction that wants to regain their freedom and regain their historic traditions, of course, it would not be easy for them to mix and continue in the same tradition again after that. And Achin further lists the consecration details of the Marthomas, and that came one after another, who was present during this time, and also the challenges they faced and the things they were able to do, as I mentioned earlier. He also speaks about the advancements of the Antiochian Syrian efforts. After the arrival of of Gregorios in Kerala, uh, the Antiochian Syrian people began to hear of the Church of Malabar, and this resulted in the coming of several priests and bishops over time to Kerala, who came and visited the people in Kerala, who gave spiritual leadership to the people in Malabar. And many of these bishops and priests who came from Syria ended up dying in Kerala later, and they are or their feast days are still celebrated in different parts of Kerala today. And all of their names, or majority of their names, are given in page 136 by Achin. And some notable names were Mar Baselios, Mar Ivanios, Andreos Bava. Those are mentioned in the book, and some brief descriptions of who these people were and what their efforts to help the church or how they impacted the church during this time was also given by Achin. And during this time, there was also an effort to bring the church back under Nestorianism that had also failed. There was a mention of a bishop who actually came from Persia during this time, and he kind of attempts to bring the church back under the Church of Persia and under the Nestorian faith. But Marthoma denies that effort and continues to, or decides to continue in unity with the Syrian Antiochian church. In lesson 5, Achin begins to talk about the Syrian Christians who joined the Roman Catholic Church. And as Achin does all along the book, if you have read the book, he's good about what the Roman historian perspective is, about mentioning what the Roman historian perspective is versus what the Indian perspective of the same history is. That gives the reader an opportunity to decide what is true and what is not. And he goes back and forth between these perspectives, and he explains how some of them are supported by evidence, so this might be true, and how the others are simply made up or cooked up stories in order to support the arguments of one faction. And for example, he shares that the Roman Catholic historians as a whole tried to make out that the Church of Malabar was, from the days of the Synod of Diamper, a part of the Church of Rome, subject to Portuguese administration. In their view, the Coonan Cross oath or the rebellion was an illegitimate revolt against the church, and they emphasize in their history that this revolt was not against Rome per se, but an expression of protest against the Portuguese. So they're saying that this revolt that the people caused was not against the Church of Rome, but it is against the political power of Portugal, or the Portuguese had over the people at that time. So you can see how they're trying to use the same history in order to say that the Church of Rome continues to be the church that the people come under. But Achin gives us a view of the Indian perspective of this part of history also, and he summarizes it pretty well in a few paragraphs in page 139. And it says, our position is this: the Church of Malabar, traditionally founded by the Apostle St. Thomas, was connected with the Church of Persia till the 16th century. The Portuguese action in converting the Church of Malabar to Roman Catholicism was totally unauthorized. Rome's claim of universal jurisdiction is not accepted by any Eastern church. And as for the Church of Malabar, it is out of ignorance of church history and incapability to hold on its own that it happened to fall into the state of Uniate Church from 1599. But after over half a century, in 1653, when an opportunity arose, the community almost as a whole abandoned that connection. So Achin makes it very clear that the Indian position regarding this is that the church had no connections with the foreign power, or meaning the Church of Rome, until the 16th century. And the Portuguese forcefully converted the Christians in this area to the Roman faith. And the Church of Malabar, out of ignorance for their own church history and out of their incapability against the political power of the Portuguese government, had to give in the Synod of Diamper. But in 1653, when there was an opportunity to take their church back, to take their independence, religious independence back, they do just that. And Achin says, Rome now used non-Portuguese European missionaries and did everything in its power to regain the loss. But even then, about half the people did not yield to Rome. Though this section did not have adequate knowledge of theology and of church history, but yet it maintained its Eastern character and ecclesiastical freedom. Ecclesiastical freedom is an important, great point to note there. Because as you can imagine, these people who are facing continued persecution over a long period of time would just want to have peace in the church. And some people found that peace in the Roman Catholic Church by just converting to them, saying that, of course, if we are converting to them, they will not persecute us anymore. And for that reason, we can worship in peace. Let it be. Maybe that was the mindset that these people chose to have. But there was the other faction who continued to fight, defending themselves. And as you can imagine, in an effort when you're trying to survive and defend your faith and defend yourself against a political power that is stronger than you, it is very hard to teach the faith or continue to pass the faith from generation to generation, because your entire attention is focused on defending yourself. So during this time, it's saying that the church, those people who wanted to continue on with the Eastern Syriac identity for the church, they were not well versed in church history or in church theology, but they knew what their tradition was and they wanted to continue in that tradition. We know that following the Kuhn and Cross oath, the church existed in two separate factions, as Achin speaks in this unit. And Achin makes the effort to list in detail the leaders of the Catholic section also. He's not only talking about the Church of Malabar that came under the Syrian faith, but he also makes an effort to talk about the leaders that are leading the Catholic faction during this time, and how they influence religion in Malabar for many decades to come. So the church is officially in two sections, the Martoma Christians the South Indian Christians of the Church of Malabar are now officially in two different sections, one under the Catholic Church, one under the Syrian Orthodox Church. And that brings us to the conclusion of Achin's book. And Achin does a good job of concluding by summarizing all the things that are spoken about in this book. And as we see later in the bibliography at the end of the book, Achin does a very good job of using many different perspectives of this same history as resources when doing his research in order to prepare this book. And Achin gives us a very good conclusion that the history of the Indian Church, which according to tradition began with the apostolate of St. Thomas till the middle of the 18th century, or until the middle of the 18th century, is discussed in this book. So from the first century, from the arrival of St. Thomas to the 18th century, Achin does a very good job of summarizing in about 150 pages. And it is very much to the point, as we have said in other classes also, not very confusing to follow. And Achin points out all the important leaders that came along this time in both sides and how they affected the church and its freedom and its faith and its traditions during this time. Achin says the Church of Malabar had three foreign connections till the 18th century, and they were with the Church of Persia in the beginning, with the Church of Rome, and then with the Syrian Church of Antioch. And as a result, the church, which till the 16th century was one, became divided into three sections. Not only that the church lost its unity, but it came to lose its character and individuality. And the following points referring to the foreign connections of the Church of Malabar before the 16th century was also mentioned. First, the Church of Malabar had connection with the Church of Persia, at least from the 4th century. Achin explains how the Persian church had a Catholicate established in the 4th century, and what was their history before that, and what were their history from the 5th century onwards, and how that relationship between the Indian church and the Church of Persia existed during this time. And Achin also mentioned to us that Nestorius, or the teaching of Nestorius, was successful in influencing the Persian church. And when they accepted Nestorianism as a church who followed in that tradition of the Persian church, the Indian church also came to adopt the Nestorian faith. And then obviously the second part of that history is the Roman connection that occurs in the 16th century. And it was following the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century that the presence of the Roman Catholic Church became a fact in India. And as a result of the work of the Portuguese missionaries, the Syrian Church of Malabar became absorbed into the Roman Catholic Church, subject to the Portuguese administrative control. And this was a time, as we have read through the book and as we know from general church history, a time of great persecution for the Syrian Christians in India because the political power of the Portuguese was very strong and there was not much the people could do against us. And we discussed all of that in detail, how the liturgy, how the faith, how the traditions were all changed to adapt the Catholic faith. And it ultimately led to the people revolting in 1653 in what we talked about as the Coon and Crows Oath. And there begins the Antiochian Christian connection from the 17th century. As we said in 1665, Mar Gregorius of Jerusalem came to Kerala, and the Antiochian connection came into existence from that date. And there is no, Achin makes us a point over and over again, that there is no prior evidence of the churches having contact with each other. The church in Antioch, the Syrian church, never had connections with the Indian church before. This is where the connection begins. As we know, they officially first come to help the church, and later they also unfortunately try to take over the church in India. And of course, we have the two factions as the Jacobites and the Orthodox faction currently existing in Kerala and obviously everywhere else in the world. And Mar Gregorius, however, at that time was an answer to the Mar and the faction that followed Mar prayers, because he came and he slowly him and his followers, including Marivanius, who would come later, was able to help the church regain its Syrian identity and come out from under the yoke of the Roman Church to establish its own individuality and independence. So that's how Achin summarizes the three great connections the Indian church had. And I hope that all of you were able to get a better picture of church history, especially when it pertaining to Indian church history and what type of faith existed in India from the first century onwards, and how the church grew and how the church evolved to the faith that we have now and the traditions that we have now. And this, from my perspective, sort of to summarize, I would say I've always thought that the survival of the Orthodox Church in India is somewhat of a miracle. If you can imagine the type of persecution that they were facing all of these years, continuing to defend themselves and their faith without much political power, it's always a miracle to me that the church, the Orthodox Church, is still the prominent Christian church in India. And I believe that is because the lineage that St. Thomas, the apostle of our Lord, left there, right? We believe it was St. Thomas that came to India and gave us the true light, the true church. And through St. Thomas, the Holy Spirit continues to work in the church and raise great leaders from time to time in every century to defend the faith and to lead the church forward. And even today, the church is facing many, different types of persecution. Uh, and I think leaders like we see Samuel Hutchin and many others who have come before him, who wanted an Indian identity to the Indian church, made it clear that the church has to be careful, and church has to be uh, mindful of the lineage that we're carrying forward in terms of the St. Thomas lineage. And we have to follow the faith properly because sometimes we take the church for granted. And it can be very easy to forget all the people that gave all of their efforts in order to protect the church and to protect the faith. Because as you can imagine, it would have been very easy for the archdeacon to give in, or later all the Marthomas that followed, for them to give in to what they were being asked to do because of political sway or for material well-being. But they all resisted all the temptations that they received in order to follow the true faith that was established to them by St. Thomas, or their forefathers by St. Thomas. So I feel proud to be a part of the Indian Orthodox Church. Uh, and let's hope that all of us can work together in carrying this torch that was given to us by our ancestors, and we are able to successfully pass it on to our children and our next generation also, helping them to understand the traditions of the church along with the history of the church and what it truly means to be an Indian Orthodox Christian. Is there anything you would like to share from your readings, or any questions or concerns that you wanted to bring up from your readings? Please do so at this time. If there is no other question.